How much was the hospital under assault? Are you still in touch? While you were there, and do you have a sense of like what's happened since?
Yeah, I mean, day one, when I would look outside of the window of the room that I was sleeping in the hospital, I could see the bombing take place. I could see smoke rising from about 10 blocks away. And of course, being from the US and working in a hospital, I was already very uncomfortable with that. I mean, it was so loud that you could hear it, and you can hear the gunfire going back and forth. As the days went on, that bombing became closer and closer. And it was clear that the Israeli military was planning on clearing Khan Younis, just like they did with Deir al-Balah, just like they did with Gaza City, just like they did with Jabalia. So it was clear that the military was moving from the north to the south. And I'm only saying that as an observer, not as a military expert. But it was getting closer and closer. There was one day where somebody had told me, hey, you might be able to capture signal if you go outside of the emergency department and just hold your phone up towards the sky. And so as I'm walking around holding my phone up, the hospital wall gets hit with a spray of bullets. And I just went immediately back inside the emergency department. And I was like, this is getting way too close. We're talking now, maybe it's 2 or 3 blocks away. There was 2 particular nights where I was convinced that the hospital was going to be hit and that I may be killed in the process. And it was clear that the tanks were rolling in. I didn't recognize the sound. It took the other physicians to tell me, do you hear that rolling sound? That's the tank that's rolling very close to the hospital. And then they showed me the lights of the tank outside, and I could see the tank rolling, and it got right outside the wall of the medical complex. And then I saw the tanks roll over a cemetery that was there. And in fact, we had, I couldn't really see it from my window. I could just see a lot of kind of dirt getting into the sky. And people had told me essentially some of the bodies in the cemetery were being taken by the military, which was something that was common. I still don't have an explanation for that. But that's how close we were able to see where the military was. And you can hear the F-35 overhead, and it felt literally like they were about to land on top of the hospital. And then you would hear a whistling noise as soon as you heard the F-35, and you knew that a missile was flying down and getting ready to hit. And honestly, I don't know why I was doing this. Maybe it was an instinct, or, it's just kind of this sort of reflex, but I was closing my eyes every time you would hear that missile blowing, just not sure if it was going to hit the hospital or not. And I thought maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe it's just because I'm, this American doctor who's used to being in a safe place, who's used to being protected. So I left my room and I was walking around. I went to the ICU. I went to the emergency department, and all of the doctors felt exactly the same way. I mean, the tenseness was in their shoulders. And I had realized they were so quiet. And as I'm trying to talk to them, they were re-traumatized. Many of these people had come from Shifa Hospital, had come from Al-Auda Hospital, had come from Kamal Adwan Hospital, and had already experienced this one time. And I remember foolishly telling them, I remember sitting there talking to the ICU doctor and saying, I think the hospital should be okay. I came through the World Health Organization. Med Global is a part of one of the World Health Organization's emergency medical teams. They tasked me here. And he looked at me and he right away responded. He said, what makes you think this hospital is any different than any of those other hospitals? What makes you think that this hospital is safe? It's safe until it's not safe anymore. And we know that it's not going to be safe anymore the second we see that we are raided, or that we're arrested, or that we're bombed. And I think for him, this was just another sort of, it was just another phase of whatever is going on, this military operation. And he fully expected that after he flees to Rafah, which he did over the next course of a week, that it would happen in Rafah at the 3 hospitals that were in Rafah, Abu Yusuf al-Najjar Hospital or the European Hospital. There was no doubt in his mind that those hospitals were next. And I spoke yesterday to one of the surgeons that was still in the hospital, and he had told me that the quadcopter had shown up, that they had essentially been told that they needed to evacuate, that there were around 300 healthcare workers, that there were 350 patients in the hospital, and there were still 5,000 to 7,000 people displaced who were sheltering inside of the hospital. And then he told me, they're telling us to evacuate, but 3 people tried to leave the premises. They tried to walk out of the front entrance of the hospital and head south, and they were hit by snipers, all 3 of them. He said, I operated on one of them. I needed to operate on one of them. So I'm not sure, what sort of situation is going to unfold at Nasser Hospital. I just know, based on speaking to the staff that are still there and based on witnessing what I witnessed, that it's going to be a massacre there. I mean, there's no doubt in any of the people that are there that something very bad is going to unfold at Nasser Hospital. And it's just a repeat of the previous hospitals and healthcare infrastructure places that have been attacked.
You mentioned the trauma of your fellow medical workers there. What of how much exposure did you have to children, both those that were brought in with injuries and medical problems, but in the surrounding area? I mean, what do you have a sense of what it's like for a child to have to live in that environment?
Yeah, I have a few things I'd like to share about that, because I think that's such an important question. I think, we're talking about a generation that's been traumatized, and that I think is I don't know if they'll ever be able to recover from this. The first would like to start with, we know that how many, out of all of the people that have been killed, whether it's 27,000 or probably going to reach well above 35,000, as you mentioned, we know that 70% of them were women and children. And I can tell you, just working in the resuscitation bay of the emergency department at Nasser, that those numbers seem pretty accurate to me. I remember one of the nights that a house was hit and a family brought in 10 people, and 3 of them were young girls between the ages of 10 and 14, all of them dead on arrival. And I remember one of the fathers asking me, please keep working, please try to save her. And it was very clear that there was nothing that I could do. And you're sitting there and you're just watching a family, a mother and a father, mourn the loss of their daughter, but also you just realize their house was bombed. So what are they going to do? I mean, they wrap up their daughter, they go and bury her, and then they look for a place that they can shelter. I mean, there's not even a second to think about what's happened. On top of that, you walk through Nasser Hospital, there are children everywhere. I mean, I remember going through the pediatric ward and seeing kids playing Ring Around the Rosie in the middle of the hospital hallway. And you'd see 5 or 6 of them. And then once that's over, they're going back to the corner of the hallway where they have a mattress with their family and they're sitting there. It's, it's really, really tough to mention this part. But that night when I was looking outside at the tanks, when I was at Nasser Hospital and we had become surrounded, there was a significant amount of panic in the tents that were outside closest to where that tank was. And I remember looking outside the window and seeing families rushing to grab whatever they could. And they were planning on walking to Rafah from Khan Younis in the middle of the night, 2 a.m., 3 a.m. I mean, just incredibly dangerous. And the thing that you see is you see a bunch of these kids just standing outside, watching their father, watching their mother grab whatever they could, and they're about to hit the road. And you hear the bombs dropping around them, and they hear the gunfire being exchanged. And you're sitting there, and you're like, how are they supposed to understand this? They're not able to go to school. They're not able to go back to their house. They're not able to play with their friends outside. They're not able to have any sort of regular, normal life. Every part of their life has been affected. And then in addition to that, you're talking about they don't have enough food. I mean, those 15 organizations that talked about the starvation, they said every family, every person in Gaza is skipping meals. Everybody's skipping meals there, including the kids. I mean, so these kids are hungry. Some of them don't have shoes or winter clothes or socks. Many of them have witnessed people in their family or friends being killed or traumatized or victims of amputees. You see many of them who have fled 4 or 5 times. I mean, before the war, I always bring this up, but before the war, there was a mental health assessment, and they said 70% of the kids in the Gaza Strip who had been born in the last 10 years needed some sort of mental health intervention. What's going to happen after the war, Sam? I mean, all of these kids have been traumatized. Nobody has been untouched in the Gaza Strip. And I don't even want to mention all of the kids who have suffered injuries, who need specialized care, who are waiting to be transferred out of the Gaza Strip somewhere. We know 6,000 people are waiting in Gaza to go to another medical facility outside of Gaza so they can get treatment. How many of them are children who will die? How many of them have been approved to leave, but their parents weren't allowed to leave, so they're stuck in the Gaza Strip? I know many cases like that where, hey, your mom and dad are not allowed to accompany you on this trip to Egypt or to Qatar or to Turkey to get the medical treatment that you need. So how are they supposed to send them? They don't speak the language of, they may not speak the language of the place that they're going to. They're probably 5 or 6 years old. How are they supposed to go and get the medical treatment that they need? I mean, when I say that this is a 360-degree assault on life in Gaza Strip, any way that you look at this in any direction or perspective, there's something catastrophic going on. The humanitarian crisis is the worst that we've seen since World War II. And the majority, you took all of the conflicts in the last 3 years, all of the war zones, and you combined all of the children that have tragically been killed in those war zones, it doesn't even amount to half of the victims that we've seen in the Gaza Strip over the course of 4 months. I mean, that's the level of violence these kids are being exposed to, and I don't know how they'll ever be able to recover from that. Let alone how we'll be able to access and provide them with the care that they need after the war, the day after the war.
You mentioned there's a 6,000 person waiting list. How is that? How do you? What is that process? I mean, are there people who are actually able to get out of Gaza for healthcare? I would imagine that that's incredibly restricted, because I would imagine that if I was there with my family, I would be attempting to, I don't know, to escape in some fashion, because it's just being closed in and closed in, and there's a sense. We should say, I guess, apparently at the moment that the evacuation or the expulsion of Nasser Hospital has just been ordered and is ongoing right now.
Yeah.
But how does that process work, where people who need immediate, urgent health care, how does that process work?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because it's something that I had a tough time figuring out while I was there on the ground. Essentially, what happens is you are treated by a doctor who says, okay, the things that you need, we can't provide for you. So here's an official recommendation. Here's the official paperwork that we're going to submit to the health ministry, to submit to the Egyptians and the Israelis, that you need to be transferred out. It has all of your information on there. We know that that number is above 6,000. I would probably say it's 6,500, but we know that so far to date, over the 4 months, that around 600 of those people have been allowed to exit. And what happens is every single day around 9 a.m., a list is produced by the Israelis and given to the Egyptians, and saying, this is the list of people who are approved to be medically evacuated from the Gaza Strip. On the day that I left the Gaza Strip back into Egypt, on the bus that I was on, 8 people of these medical evacuees were on there. And the average per day is between 7 and 10 medical evacuees. And so we know that if you have 6,000, and that you're talking about 6 or 7 of them are leaving a day, or 10 of them on a great day, 10 of them are being able to leave, then we know that there's going to be unnecessary excess mortality. People are going to die waiting for this. And there are several people with stories who said, we were waiting for this to happen. And the most vulnerable out of all of these patients are going to be the young children. We're talking about infants, neonates, people under 6 months who are waiting for whatever reason to get that specialized care. They will die waiting. Now, let's say that you don't get approved. Let's say that you have somebody who you desperately needs medical care. You're still waiting on the list. There is an alternative. That alternative is you can go to the Egyptian border and you can pay an Egyptian officer between 10 and 13,000 US dollars, and then you'll be able to get out. And that's something that's prohibitively expensive. It's something that barely anybody in the Gaza Strip is able to do, especially at this point. And anybody who was able to do that did that very early on during this war. They're not able to do that anymore. So, I mean, this is why
you're basically bribing a customs official or something like that to get across. And we should say, unemployment was at 50% 5 months ago. I would imagine nobody's getting paid really in any type of sort of like a black market type of situation there, right? I mean, the entire society at this point is completely been just completely fractured.
100%. I mean, that's such an important point. Nobody's getting paid. The entire infrastructure, the civilian infrastructure has collapsed. And what you see on the street, if you're walking, you see people who've kind of posted up. They're selling the aid that they've received to get something else that they need. So they're bartering. I mean, if you have a can of tuna and you need feminine hygiene products, you're trying to see if you can make that trade. I mean, that's how desperate the situation has come. I do also want to mention that there is this sort of black market that exists where some of these products are getting in and being sold. Of course, it's insanely inflated. It's coming in from the Egyptian side. And then one example is diapers. Diapers for around 12 diapers, it used to cost 20 shekels, which is $8. Right now, you can't find that same packet of diapers. It's 4 times the cost, 80 something shekels. So almost 15, 20 bucks. And that's something that you can see, you can find it, but barely anybody can afford this. Nobody really has anything that they're getting paid. So people are tapping into their life savings And many of them at this point have run out of their money. I mean, just because of the basic necessities that they need and it being inflated and so high during this wartime. I mean, people have essentially run out of money. And that's when you start to really worry about what sort of happens, because up until this point, I think the Palestinian people have been so resilient, and you can actually walk through Rafah and you see that the only thing that's holding the society together is that sort of dignity and sort of that resilience that they have. They're able to figure out who needs aid the most, and it's leaders from each family that's deciding, okay, you can get this aid, you can get this blanket, you can get this tent because you desperately need it or you have a lot of kids. If we keep pushing them, to the brink of collapse, I'm just very concerned about what happens to people. I'm very concerned about when, they've done things, we know this. The Palestinians have resorted to looking at animal feed, sorting out all of the dirt that they could and using that as food. They are in a very desperate situation, especially in the north of Gaza. And so I'm very concerned about what happens.
What about pregnant women at this point? I mean, what is happening with pregnant? I imagine there's no prenatal, postnatal care at this. How are babies being delivered?
Yeah, this is a population of people who are being totally neglected. They're being asked to just show up when they're in labor. They'll go to the closest health access point or to a hospital. There's really only one obstetric hospital that's able to deliver patients and perform C-sections. And those hospitals are so overcrowded that one of the doctors that I met who was pregnant and had delivered her son had a C-section and was asked 4 hours later to get up and go back to her tent because they needed that bed. 4 hours after a C-section, that's insane. Here in the States, we ask our patients who have C-sections to stay in bed for, 5 days so that they don't have any sort of trauma to the area where they had the surgery. And we know that there's an increased amount of stillborn births, miscarriages, complications from these obstetric complications. We know that they're not getting the prenatal vitamins that they're supposed to be getting. They're not getting the screening that they're supposed to be getting in their first or second trimester. And we know that many of them are even delivering in their tents with, local experienced women, or if there's a midwife that happens to be in that internally displaced camp. And of course, you can imagine if you're delivering inside of the tent, what are you using to cut the umbilical cord? What are you using to wash the newborn baby? What are we giving the mothers? There was this really tragic video that came out about a newborn baby, and the mother was trying to breastfeed him. And she said, I just don't have enough milk because I'm not getting enough food. So she had grabbed a date and had put this wrap around it and put it in the baby's mouth so that he could try to suck some of the juice from the date. And that's one story. Imagine the mother who's unable to breastfeed her child. She's desperately searching for formula milk, and that we know is very, very much in short supply. It's not entering the Gaza Strip as much as it needs, and that puts over 5,000 kids under the age of 6 months at risk who are depending on this formula feed. That's it. Again, I feel like this is a part of the sort of the hidden tragedy, the things that we are not able to really hear about as much. It's, you're talking about pregnant patients and neonates, but even people with heart disease or diabetes or kids with cystic fibrosis, or they have other pediatric diseases. All of them are being neglected, and none of those non-communicable disease medicines are entering into the Gaza Strip. I can tell you countless amounts of people who were begging me when I leave if I could potentially look for over-the-counter medications that would make a difference. There's an over-the-counter vitamin for a disease that's affecting 15 people in the Gaza Strip, 15 kids in the Gaza Strip. It's this genetic disease that they have, and all they need is this vitamin that's available everywhere. And I remember the doctor coming up to me and said, if you can get us 50 of these vitamins, if you can get us 50 pills, you will be saving the lives of these 15 kids. And I had to leave the Gaza Strip, and I don't know if they were ever able to get those vitamins, and I don't know what became of those kids that are suffering from that genetic disease. And so, this is truly something that I think long after this war is over, we're going to keep peeling back the layers of this tragedy, the layers of the horrifying thing that the people in the Gaza Strip are dealing with.